Another concept that we need to be familiar with before we move on are functions. In programming, functions are used to isolate a group of code statements so that other parts of the program can use the code inside of it. We'll talk more as we move throughout next semester about why functions are so important and so useful. But for right now, just know that it allows us to isolate our code so that we can call upon it when we need to and maybe call upon it multiple times. And then because this code is isolated, it's set aside from the rest of our code, that code inside the function will only be executed if we call the function. So let's look at the syntax for a function. In JavaScript, you begin to create a function with the keyword function. So here in red are the things that you will always have. They will always stay the same in a function. You use the JavaScript keyword function and then you give it a name. You can call it whatever you want to call it. Usually you need to name it something descriptive that helps describe or identify the function. And the same rules apply to variables. Like don't use reserved words. Stay away from punctuation, and we use the camel case notation. You'll have a set of parentheses because whenever you type a function or a method, you always type parentheses. Now later on, we'll talk about what sometimes goes inside of those parentheses, but for right now, just parentheses. Then we have a set of curly brackets and all the code statements that we want associated with that function. Now I said that these are set aside, so these code statements only execute when the function is called. Now, a typical function call, just a basic function call, looks something like this. You just type the name of the function, set of parentheses, semicolon, and that will call the function or call the code inside of here to be executed. For JavaScript, we typically like our functions to be called when some kind of event occurs, like the user clicks somewhere on the page, the web page loads, the user hovers the mouse over an image or a link, or the user selects an item from a form. To help us listen for these events, we use event listeners. The event listener method is a way for us to listen to particular events that are occurring. The code for this is in the window object. So we use the window object dot the method add event listener, and in parentheses we have a couple of parameters, but the only one that we are worried about right now is the event and the name of the function, and then we just have false. So again, what's in red will always be in your event listener. This will change depending on the event. So we can have a load event, we can have a click event. This would be when the page loads. We'll practice with a click event in just a minute. And this is the name of the function. And don't worry about this, we'll talk about it later. Before we get started on this project to help us understand what's happening, let me just quickly demo what our final page will look like. We have 3 buttons. Each button is going to prompt the user for their pet's name. So maybe I have a pet goldfish named Yoshi. So my pet's name is Yoshi. My pet is a goldfish. And maybe my pet goldfish is really old and was born in 1879. Okay, so after the user inputted some information, it was output on our screen, and this did a calculation to determine the pet's birth year. Now that you see what this page looks like, let's get started on the code. In your Google Drive, I've dropped pet pet.html. It should be someplace easy for you to find. So if you don't see it, just shoot me an email and I'll send it your way. Currently, this page looks something like this when we load it in a browser. We have 3 buttons. But if we look at our code, right now our buttons don't do anything. If we look at our code, we have 3 H3s. That's where we're going to have our output appear, where it'll say my pet's name is, and then whatever the user types for the pet's name. My pet is whether it's a cat, dog, hamster, lizard, whatever. And then the last one is going to calculate the age of the pet. So it's going to take the year the pet was born and subtract that from 2020, and that will give us the pet's age. We're going to use functions to accomplish this task so that we can be introduced to functions. So let's go ahead and add our script tags. We're going to add that right before our body closes. And let's begin by creating our first function. This function is going to be used to display the pet's name. Okay, so let's use the keyword function, and then we'll give it a descriptive name. How about display name? Notice my camel case there. JavaScript is very case sensitive, so it's really important that you type things correctly. I want to prompt the user for the pet's name, and because I want to use that information later on, I need to store it in a variable. So I'll do var name equals prompt, enter your pet's name. Next, I want to print your pet's name is, and then whatever the user typed, to this H3. Okay, now if I use just a document.write, it won't function properly. I can't target exactly where I want this text to appear. So why don't we give this H3 an ID? Okay, so I'm going to go up there to that H3. ID equals show name. We'll just give it something descriptive. So now I can target this whole element. Do you remember what code does that? Document.getElementById, and because it has an ID show name, I can put that in the parentheses. Now that gets me here, but I want to be here inside the 2 tag sets, inside the tag set. So I have to use inner HTML. Now we are just giving this object a value. The value we're going to give it is what we want the text to appear. We want text to say, okay, we want it to say my pet's name is, and then whatever the user typed. Do you think this is going to work? Well, let's try it out and see. Refresh. Here, nothing's happening. I'm pressing that button. I'm pressing that button. Nothing's still happening. We have not called the function, okay? So I said we could call a function. A typical function call would look just something like that. That's saying, hey, run this function. And when this code executes, it goes inside those curly braces and runs all those lines of code that are inside that curly braces for this particular function name. Now, if I run this, look what happened. It prompted me as soon as the page loaded. That's not what I wanted. I wanted it to load when we pressed that button, okay? So here's where event listeners come in. We need an event listener that is listening for a click on this button. For us to listen to a click on this button, we have to identify where this button is in our code. So here's what we need. Deleting that. I'm going to give this button an ID. I'll say ID name. Okay? Notice that I did not give this button the same ID as I gave this because an ID has to be unique in our code. Now that this has an ID, I can use document.getID dot get element by ID to target that line of code. So now this code is able to access this whole object. Okay, it's able to access that button. Now I'm going to add an event listener to it. The event listener method listens for the event of something occurring in the browser. In this case, we want a click on this button. So we'll do click. The next parameter that we include in parentheses is what function we want to execute. So when a click occurs on this button, we want this function to execute. So we'll type display name and false. Okay, so let's test it now and see if it works. Refresh. What is your pet's name? My pet's name is Julie. Okay. All right, there we go. So let's repeat this process, practicing for what type of animal and your pet's birth year. Below our first function, let's create a second function. We'll call this function display type. We want to prompt the user for what type of animal they have, and we want to store that in a variable. So let's say var pet type and prompt the user. I want the results of this function to print out in this H3. So let's give this H3 an ID. Now that this H3 has an ID of show type, we can target that whole element by using document.getElementById show type. But it's not enough just for us to get this element, because we want to change what is inside those tags. We use .enterHTML. Now let's give that object a new value. Okay, mine says my pet is a, and then we're going to print the value of pet type. Remember, this is not enough in and of itself to make any code run. We have to call the function. And we are going to call the function when the user clicks this button. We need a way to access this button so we can listen for that click. So let's give this button an ID. I'll call it ID type. Now let's add another event listener. We'll use document.getElementById and look for the ID type ID. We'll add an event listener to that object. It is listening for a click event, and when it hears that click, when the window hears that click, it will run the function display type. This function here. Let's run our code and see if it works. What type of animal? Cat. My pet is a cat. What's my cat's name? Okay, last function. On our last function, we want to ask the user for their pet's birth year, and we're going to display the pet's age. Again, we'll create a variable. Let's call it year born. And the user is going to enter the year born, but we're going to subtract it, the current year. We're going to take the current year and subtract it from that number to get the pet's age. And because we're going to do math with this prompt value, what do we need to do? If you said parse int, you are correct. So let's parse int and then prompt the user to enter the year your pet was born. Okay, we want the calculation to output in this H3. So let's give our third and final H3 a value I'll say ID show age. So now that it has an ID, we can come to our JavaScript, document.getElementById, show age, because I want to change what is inside that tag set, .enter HTML. Okay, so I want the new value of the inside of that H3 element to be my pet is concatenated with a calculated value of 2020 minus year born. Okay, that function's not going to do anything until we call that function. So let's add an event listener. Oh, we got to add an ID to this button first. So let's go back up to this button. It needs an ID or we can't access it. So we'll give it an ID of ID year. So now we can address it with document.getElementById, ID year, .add event listener, on a click, we want it to execute the function display age, and that's false. So double check your code. If you're encountering any errors, just pause the video and look back, or email me and I'll be glad to help you. So refreshing our browser, let's try all over. My cat's name is Patchouli. My cat is a cat. And my pet was born in 2019. So my pet is 1. We'll continue to practice with these. These will be commonplace before you know it. Functions, document.getElementById, enter HTML, event listers are all common code in JavaScript. So as you continue to practice with it, you'll become more familiar. If you have questions, email me. I'll be glad to answer. Let's review the guidelines for this project after your functions and events. So in your Google Drive, I've dropped a file called mariostarstore.html. If you don't see this in your shared folder, email me and I will send it to you. In this project, you're going to create a function called calcCost. You'll prompt the user to enter how many stars they would like to buy. Then when the user enters that amount, you'll display the results in a paragraph that has the ID of show total. The result should calculate the cost, like how many stars the user wants to buy, multiplied by 3. So they're 3, each star costs 3 coins, we'll say. If the user entered 12, the output would be 12 stars will cost you 36 coins. Use an event listener to call the calc function when the button is clicked. So you'll have one function for this project, not like 3 like we had in the tutorial, and one event listener. So let's see what this project looks like. This would be your website, Mario Star Store. If the user clicks buy stars, and we say how many we want to buy, so if we said 12 stars, okay, 12 stars will cost you 36 coins. If we did 20, it should say 60. 20 stars will cost you 60 coins. Remember, you'll have to do math to get this number, so make sure you're doing what you're supposed to do with a math prompt, or with a prompt that you do math with the value. Okay, good luck. Email me if you have questions.